Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Left Hand. This episode is going to be a crossover with the Acid Horizon podcast, a way to let listeners of both shows know that the other is still out there, alive and well. And while we were recording, it immediately dawned on me that this particular topic and the thinkers in play made it the perfect candidate for a crossover. Today, Emma Stam is hosting Left Hand with me, SEREPTIE, riding shotgun, and we have brought into the studio Sujit Thomas, an anthropologist of science, medicine, and technology, whose current work leads us into some genuinely uncharted territory at the intersection of psychedelic science, end-of-life care, and the philosophical problem of death itself. We're talking about Foucault, Deleuze, Nietzsche, psilocybin, pastoral power, and what it means to die well, or at all, under late capitalism. It's a heavy one, for sure. And keep in mind that much of our discussion today circulates around the themes of terminal illness, end-of-life care, and some related sensitive issues. But we think you're going to love it. So if you are a left-hand listener and you haven't checked out Acid Horizon, now is the time, and vice versa. Make sure you're subscribed to both. And if you want to hear more about our scholarships and summer course series over at Acid Horizon Research Commons, stick around after the discussion wraps up. All right, let's turn our ear to Sujit Thomas.
Hello and welcome to Left Hand. This is Emma. Today, SEREPTIE and I are joined by Dr. Sujit Thomas. Sujit is an anthropologist of science, medicine, and technology with expertise in North America and Europe. He's been a visiting scholar at the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Behavior at UCLA, and he was also an instructor in the departments of anthropology and experimental humanities at New York University. His book project, The Open Brain, Repair and Enhancement in the Age of Plasticity, is an ethnography of neuroscientists, psychiatrists, patients, and drug users in New York City, London, and Oxford. It focuses on the revival in the neurosciences of marginalized cybernetic and psychedelic paradigms from the 1960s, and their implications for our collective understanding of human consciousness and mental disorders. He also currently leads the Psychedelic Thanatology research group associated with the Psychedelic Humanities Lab at the New School, which is actually what we'll be talking about today, Sujit's work on psychedelics and death. Sujit, we're very excited to have you join us.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So perhaps you could start by giving us a bit of background on your scholarship that helps us to situate you in particular traditions and ongoing conversations. You're an anthropologist who also works in science and technology studies, but you're also quite conversant with theory. So if you could paint a picture for us about what that has looked like for you, that would be great.
My general take on anthropology has been that it's one of those last 19th century disciplines which encompasses everything. And so although I work largely in labs and in clinics, my orientation towards anthropology has always been, I don't see it as fundamentally distinct from any other inquiry into the human sciences. It is fundamentally a philosophical project, the discipline in its entirety. So when I think about the role that theory plays in my work or in the way I think about anthropology, to some extent, this comes from an orientation within the discipline, which is simply to defamiliarize what you take for granted and to do that by venturing into the strange. And that's basically the theoretical point of departure. And that lends itself to pretty much anything that you would construe as continental philosophy or analytic philosophy or science studies, whatever it might be. And I see these as ways in which you frame problems and pick out from the everyday what is worth paying attention to as an ethnographer. The theory is really what sets up a question and allows you to see what might resemble an answer.
I wanted to ask if you could say a little bit more about the specific theorists, theoretical questions, and lineages that you've worked with most closely.
I think the formative influences were always Michel Foucault and Bruno Latour, at least in the way I set up my own research projects. I principally studied psychiatry and the sciences as an ethnographer, which means that I'm interested in the historical constitution of in this case, the brain, but as of the mind as an object of representation and of intervention. And that comes to some extent from Foucault's early work on psychiatry. It is also framed by a tradition in the history of science and the philosophy of science, which is called historical epistemology, which is really about how a field or a research object comes into being. And what is interesting to me is how we navigate the line between rationality and irrationality, between psychopathology and normal states as they emerge within disciplines and as they are forms of experience. So that angle is something that was sort of constitutive for me. And then after that, it was very much a question of building a foundation in continental and analytic philosophy more broadly construed. The way I think about this is anthropologists sometimes say you've got to have these touchstone schools or theorists, if you like. Well, some do. So for me, it was always the schooling in Heidegger and Wittgenstein that sort of anchored me in ethnographic questions, to be asked about what it is to live in a particular kind of world, how we make sense of it, and how we speak and understand it. And then somewhere along the line, I discovered Gilles Deleuze. And for a very long time now, Deleuze has sort of informed the way I think about a lot of things. I try not to cite Deleuze. I like to let him sort of work as a subterranean influence and to organize stuff for me when I can't necessarily see it. I think the piece I always return to is The Body Without Organs. And it's often which really is a question of, well, how do you constitute an object? How do you understand a technology? You really are going to find some very provocative answers to these questions if you're working in a broadly Deleuzean lens. And then to the extent that I'm interested in subjectivity and in psychopathology, the idea of the multiplicity of the mind, multiplicity of the subject, in fact, destroying that sense of unity itself, I found to be very generative in setting up questions and trying to understand how psychedelics might be interesting topics for anthropological analysis.
Well, Sujit, you really showed up on the right podcast here today, because Emma had sent me your project overview in addition to the Psychedelic Thanatology paper. Of course, am going to my go-to mediators, which include, of course, Foucault, Deleuze, Nietzsche, Bataille, even especially thinking about death in particular. So that's exciting. Many of the questions and the way that I frame them, and I tried to situate them in an ongoing conversation that this podcast and the Acid Horizon podcast already has in progress. But I think one of the things that I want to start with, if you would allow, is just talking about this concept of psychedelic thanatology very generally in practice. A couple of years ago, I had an interesting Uber ride where the driver was also a death doula in training. And in the course of that ride, she told me everything about it. And then I kind of told her what I did. And then she gave me a kind of strong invite, like, hey, if you want to know more about this, and this is something that perhaps you would like to become, you should think about it. And I was terrified at the prospect, right? But that aside, some of the things that the papers that were provided to us, and maybe we can even link some of those in the show notes, but immediately I went to Foucault and thinking about the death doula, and more specifically, psychedelic thanatology, as activating or instigating a kind of pastoral power. The death doula as this steward of the transition between life and death that reinscribes some notion of subjectivity, normality. And those are some of the concerns that came up in some of this preliminary literature that we're looking at. And I have a whole slew of questions that have come out of this. And rather than dump them on you all at once, maybe we can just talk about that. Talk about what it is a psychedelic thanatologist does. And maybe we can connect it to Foucault's pastoral power a bit, since he's one of your mediators.
Oh, yeah. The pastoral power question is very interesting here. So psychedelic thanatology is more or less a term of my own invention. It was ironic. I was sort of mocking the tendency of psychedelic scholars to come up with these baroque terms. But either way, it stuck. And for me, the question was simply, how does psychedelic science know death? thanatology as a field, as a body of knowledge, as well as something that informs practice as a way of knowing death, actually emerges roughly around the same time that psychedelic science takes off in the late 1960s. And it comes up around the hospice movement. And there are people who are talking back and forth about how do you deal with, how do you counsel people who are confronting their imminent demise, sometimes people who are quite young, who have terminal cancer. Your death doula friend is an offspring of that movement from the late 1960s. I've encountered a few death doulas in the psychedelic underground, where I also spent some time doing fieldwork. And a lot of it is how do you deal with the way that death presents itself to you at a particular moment when you are not prepared for it? How does it change how how does it change yourself and the way you understand your place in the world when you realize just how fragile your existence is? For a long time, this is the sort of area that was left to chaplains, quite literally bestowed of power. It is something that was mediated by one or another kind of sacral authority. And that is no longer the case in this from the 60s onwards, when people are dying in ICUs or in heavily medical settings. Foucault gives you a sort of opposition implicitly and explicitly between the clinical gaze and pastoral power when it comes to dealing with not only with psychiatric disorders across the board, but really about how, in terms of technologies of living, the clinical gaze pathologizes. It tries to find an object within you that's disordered. Pastoral power, on the other hand, through eliciting certain forms of speech, allows you to act upon yourself and in some way, while assimilating some kind of disciplinary structure, to use it to restore vitality rather than to purely become subjected. Now, what happens here in the case of psychedelic thanatology, and the project deals with end-of-life care and the role that psychedelics play in this, is that you've got all sorts of interesting forms of let's say therapy for the moment, that enter into negotiating this liminal moment. And I don't know what to do with the fact that there are shamans in these clinics, and there are people who have been trained in one or another chaplaincy tradition alongside psychiatrists, right? So this is where clinical gaze and pastoral power seem to find some kind of rapprochement. And this is there in the hospice movement, it precedes it. But the fact that it crops up here is what is especially compelling to me now that psychedelic science has become mainstream once again.
Maybe just one more orienting question, and this isn't going to be theoretically in the weeds, but what does psychedelic thanatology or psychedelic therapy at the end of life, what does it look like? What are the substances that are used? What does the practice itself, how does that unfold?
Mm-hmm. So typically it is psilocybin for most of the clinical trials. I should say none of this is legal yet. It's purely for research purposes at this point. So they're all clinical trials, although the expectation is there are going to be clinics within about, they keep saying 5 years, hasn't happened yet. But these are patients who have terminal diagnoses and who have also been diagnosed with end-of-life depression and acute anxiety. And they come in for these sessions in clinics where you have these, well, there are other interesting spaces. You've got this bed set up and you've got a therapist, two therapists in the room and a psychiatrist outside to provide medical support if required. The room is done up in the most unusual sort of way. There could be statues of the Buddha for some reason. There could be gongs. There could be there's Hindu statuary in there. It's very, very odd. There are mandalas. There is an Eastern theme. You might pick up on this. And there is a soundtrack that they listen to, which is again vaguely sort of sacred. It could range, to be honest, from Bach's Mass in B minor to Hans Zimmer. To the Beatles' Here Comes the Sun, right? So you have this soundtrack pumped into your ears through these headphones and eye shades over your eyes, and you ingest in pill form, typically, psilocybin, which is the psychoactive ingredient in magic mushrooms, and then you prepare for a mystical experience, which you have been primed for through conversations with your therapist and your psychiatrist in advance, and which is supposed to deliver you, in some sense, from a fear of your impending mortality. The session could typically last about 6 to 8 hours, and then you come out of it, and then there is integrative psychotherapeutic support. You may have If it's end of life patients, they might have 2 or 3 months to live. So there's one session with a really high dose of psilocybin and then psychotherapy every week that follows. And what people say is that it compels them to look very differently on what is left of their lives and how to find meaning within it, how to relate to the people who are special to them, what to leave behind, and how not to carry too much with them. And the thanatology problem arose from the fact that technically, as the philosophical account of it goes, it changes the way they think about death itself as a terminus or as a passage. Those are two ways in which it's framed. And that is something that is a bit tricky for in medical spaces because you're dealing with the mystical, in a domain that technically has no place for it in the clinical.
That's a good place to go a bit more deep into what this research project that you're leading is really about. Part of the description of the project, I'll read it here. It's that there's controversy surrounding psychedelic evangelism, that's quote unquote psychedelic evangelism, in blending spirituality with psychedelic medicine. This has led critics to warn against the imposition of religious values on vulnerable patients, despite the evidence indicating that such experiences and whatever belief shifts or shifts in ways of thinking they might precipitate, despite the evidence that this mental shift might be psychopharmacologically inevitable and perhaps more important, therapeutically necessary. So, Sujit, you and I are both familiar with the philosopher Chris Leatherby's argument regarding metaphysical belief shift, and that is an indispensable starting point to this project. So I wonder if you could talk about that a bit in the context of the controversy surrounding psychedelic evangelism.
Mm-hmm. So the metaphysical belief change, metaphysical belief shift idea is very curious because in the larger trajectory of psychedelic science and therapy, it's a relatively recent idea. It's really 2023, 2024 that it becomes a thing. And the philosopher Leatherby makes the case that in the case of end-of-life anxiety patients, the positive outcomes are facilitated by having this powerful mystical experience, which leads to changes in your worldview. And he uses the term, you sort of move towards a non-physicalist worldview, abandoning a naturalistic worldview, right? He doesn't unpack those terms very effectively. But if you follow his references and you look at the studies he's talking about, effectively it comes down to certain questions about the afterlife, about the nature of consciousness, about what persists, about sentience and awareness in the world, and the notion that your beliefs about these things change under the influence of psychedelic drugs, and that change in what you believed, in the things that you believe to be aware and sentient in the world, often it takes the form of a kind of animism, that this is in some way therapeutic for people who are dealing with depression. And the contention comes from the fact that, well, what if this is a form of abuse, right? What sort of medicine is this that seems to demand that you make this massive change in the way you perceive the world, in your beliefs about the world? Is there something intrinsically harmful about persuading people at the end of their lives that the planet is alive, plants are alive, I will survive the end of my physical existence? There is some sort of cosmic entity of which we are all a part. And so this became a kind of vexed question, and the philosopher Chris Leatherby made the case, look, this is fine for end-of-life anxiety patients, but it's not going to work in the mainstreaming of psychedelic drugs to people with ordinary depression. And what is more, that is where you're likely to run into greater risk of abuse, and that the hypersuggestibility induced by psychedelic drugs is short-lived. It's fine for people who are about to die. It's almost that. It's the comforting delusion idea, right? That's one response to that problem. And if it is the case that the mystical experience induces this transformative stance in how you deal with what is present in the world and what is not. Well, what implications can that have for somebody's life and the decisions that they make in the short time that they have left? So it became a bioethical question. And what we wanted to try and understand is, well, two or three things. One was, is this a thing? Is it the case that psychedelic therapy, in the case of these patients, actually induces something like a metaphysical belief change? Which is to say, does it actually persuade people that there is an afterlife or that there is a cosmic consciousness or whatever? That was our first question. And then we wanted to know, well, if that is the case, is it responsible for people getting better? And how is it that patients are speaking about this? How is it that psychiatrists and researchers speak about this? How do they think about the risks? But ultimately, what does it mean to change the way death and its relation to life under the pressure, if you like, of a mystical experience in supposedly secular clinical spaces, right? And how this is set up as a problem from 1960s onwards to the emergence of psychedelic science and the way it's playing out now.
Yeah, the first thing that my mind goes to, and maybe this is a cynical view, but I just see it as a critical view. What this proposed research tells me from a philosophical perspective, informed by Foucault and informed by Deleuze in particular, is that lurking beneath our generally Western secular beliefs is a form of evangelism that then turns into this reversal and an undercutting of the sort of materialist, secularist view that's said to inhabit the clinic. But the thing that I find funny or ironic about it is that when we look at the scene where the psychedelic event goes down, it of course, on the one hand, and here's where I don't want to be cynical, is that people have real values invested in the image of the Buddha, Bodhisattva, mandalas, any acoustic track by George Harrison that might be playing at the time. A lot of this looks like the world of the American middle class that emerged in the post-hippie era. So it already has that sort of subjectivity kind of wrapped around it. But at the same time, maybe as somebody who instantiates that subjectivity, at least partially, maybe that's the way that I do want to experience the end of my life. But it also comes fraught with a lot of assumptions or presuppositions about how a life should end. Why isn't it the case that if we're thinking like through Kierkegaard or Heidegger, for example, there is a persistent anxiety that lurks beneath us that will be present in the moments prior to death? And why should we cut ourselves off from that? And perhaps there is something about affirming life in that color and shape right at the very end that has something to do either with the meaning of life or the achievement of ecstasy, or maybe there is no ecstasy. And this is just the way that it goes. This doesn't mean necessarily that we have to take death on the nose, but it seems that we're repressing something. It doesn't just speak to the fact about what a good death looks like, but also what a good life might look like. Lurking beneath all of that is the question of the good life. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that matter.
Oh, several thoughts. I'm glad you posed it that way. Yeah, the existentialist strain in this kind of science is something that is it's embedded. It's never stated explicitly. We know that one of the scientists who was responsible for the emergence of this field was heavily influenced by Binswanger and existential psychotherapy from the 50s onwards. He told me when I interviewed him last that he was really getting into Heidegger. Great. Surprisingly late in his life, but the question of the relation to death as a relation to life, whether you take it from Kierkegaard or if you go further back, if you like, to Seneca, right? It returns to this central question, which is, what does it mean to live with death in the everyday, or to live with its memory, to recall it, to have it at hand, right? And there are two ways to think about this. One is that you should keep thinking about death in everything that you do. That's the Stoic answer. It's also in some ways, in a certain way, the Buddhist answer. You just have to remember everything is transient, everything's going to go, live knowing that death is imminent, and so forth. That's one way of coming at it. The other is in some ways the Spinozistic answer, which is think least of death, right? Why do you want to live endlessly in the consciousness of death with the awareness of it? Does it suck away the joy that you might feel in the moment? And in fact, shouldn't the ebb and flow of joy and sorrow be something that you truly and fully experience, rather than trying to flatten yourself by recalling that death is imminent? This idea of the encounter with death, right, is really, really compelling. So now Heidegger has this thing, right? He says that most of the time we don't think about death, and that's a problem, right? It's almost the reenactment of the Stoic thing. You always turn away from it. You don't want to confront the contingency of your life, right? And then you reckon with this fact. You reckon with the temporality of being. You have this moment of utter angst where everything is precarious. And in that moment, you make an authentic modification, right? And you change your way of being in the world. And that leads in all sorts of interesting directions. Because if you turn it into a political project, there can be some disastrous implications for nation states. There's a reason Heidegger took on certain views in the late 20s. But in the case of how this plays out in psychedelic science, it's quite interesting. You ask the question of whether one ought not to tangle with this anxiety. And I would say, are there, now inhabiting the perspective of the psychedelic scientists, is it not the case that certain psychopathologies, if you like, or certain forms of suffering may be caused precisely by ignoring the haunting presence of death, by repressing that fact, right? And in that sense, does tangling with death become a therapeutic experience, right? Not necessarily one that is transformative to the point that it brings you to an authentic modification, although there is a case for that, but in that it helps you make peace with something that otherwise you simply cannot accept, right? And that seems to be the case with a lot of these patients. Accepting the fact of their mortality, something that they may or may not have been setting aside all their lives. We can't necessarily tell. It's on a case-by-case basis. It will vary. But the struggle of accepting your imminent mortality is the source of the depression in this framework, right? It is the source of the anxiety that they feel, in this case of sort of clinical anxiety, about, well, what am I going to do now, right? What sort of life shall I lead? What happens to the people that, oddly enough, in the existentialist account, the problem of people who you might have to leave behind, and the people who are going to mourn you doesn't usually come up, right? You have to go all the way back to Plato to hear the statement, well, my death is not my problem. It's everybody else's problem, right? But really, for somebody who is negotiating the fact that they're going to die, often it's a question of, well, what happens to the people I care for? There is also a tremendous sense of unfairness. If it's somebody who's 47 years old, a mother of two, they're suddenly diagnosed with cancer, they have 2 or 3 months to live, right? It's a different sort of anxiety that you're confronting then. And it's a sense of loss of meaning, because after all, there's no scope for a life of authentic modification after this, really, or the scope is 2 months, right? So what do you do with that fact? Now, the psychedelic answer to that is, oddly enough, you need to experience death in the psychedelic experience. It's almost like a form of inoculation. There's this really nice quote from one of the studies from the 1960s, where the patient says to the researcher, I get it now. By stripping away this meanness, my sense of me, you're giving me a little dose of what is to come. So you get a little dose of what is to come under the influence of the psychedelic drug. In some way, you experience death through the psychedelic experience. And in that way, you are preparing yourself preparing yourself for the fact that you are actually going to die. Now, what makes this all more sort of confusing is, if the insight is that there's going to be some way in which you live on, well, what sort of encounter with death is that?
Right. Exactly. One of the ways that I tend to think about the image of death, the energy of the experience of the image of death, whether we're just talking about basal consciousness or a psychedelic experience, to me, is a surface effect of life itself. And our orientation to it is either affirmative or reactive in the Nietzschean or Deleuzean sense. But I'll put that on pause. Emma, you can go for it.
Sure. Although I'm actually really curious about where you were going with that. So maybe we can tie all of these threads together. I've been writing things down as you've been speaking, Sujit, about how this all relates to psychedelic capitalism and Foucauldian and Deleuzean threads. But I have a particular question that has been bugging me since this project started, which was in late 2024. So I feel like I need to get it out there. This regards what is actually going on to the degree that we can understand it. Let's take the example of the 47-year-old woman with 2 children who is given 3 months to live, and she has a treatment with psilocybin, as you described, and experiences relief from the anxiety and depression associated with this diagnosis. We might start by looking at what I would just call the LEPHT question, which is, does this entail a shift in propositional belief? And let me expand on that a little bit. So the idea, and I might not be doing full justice to the complexities of Leatherby's thinking, but basically it's that there would be a shift from, let's say this woman couldn't really accept the possibility of a life after the natural body has expired, and pursuant to these treatments, she thinks that something like consciousness may go on. The question would be, if that is true, if that happens, is that still the direct causal factor for the emotional relief? And maybe we could complicate this a bit further and say, maybe regardless of whether that happens or not, the lines between the affective shift, the shift in subjectivity, and the shift in belief, to me, seem necessarily much more complicated than that. And in fact, the very idea that belief shift entails a shift in propositional knowledge claims that are metaphysical in nature, or at least pertain to this state of ultimate reality. I'm not sure I buy that either. That's what belief is actually about. So I've actually laid out a very complicated table for you here, but you can pick up on that wherever you want to go.
No, I think this is a central question, right? And after all, these shifts in belief are not only going to be about your own personal consciousness. It could be literally, are stones alive, right? Now, what on earth does our stones are alive have to do with I now am at peace with my death, right? And here's the thing: we've been interviewing scientists and reviewing some of these studies, and well, what we've been finding is that the let the be position is not sustained. The scientists that we've interviewed so far don't really recognize their metaphysical belief change framework so far. Right? You have to really press them a little bit. Now, again, I should say this, it's the beginning of the project. I'm sure different lab groups have their different cultures. They're going to come at it in different ways. But like, we know that there are lab groups that have found this. Still, the notion that you can in some way find emotional relief, that you can make peace with the fact of your demise by learning that a stone is alive, does not make much sense. Right? It makes somewhat more sense if you're able to apply it to your own consciousness, to some persisting sense of awareness in the world after you pass, that can be a source of peace. But there are plenty of patients for whom this has not played a role. That's the other side of it, right? There are positive outcomes in these studies, these end-of-life clinical trial studies, that feature no metaphysical belief change content, or very, very little, where the patients don't necessarily attribute such a high degree of significance to that, right? So the Leatherby claim that this is the major factor, so far as where we are at the moment, doesn't really hold up, right? And that in itself is something that we're really out to understand. Well, if it's not that, then what role do these metaphysical belief changes play when they do happen? And if it's not the metaphysical belief change, then what is it that is compelling people to come to a new acceptance of their mortality, if that is what is happening, right? This remains an open question for ethnography. It's something that we'll be able to make more sense of as we go on. But yeah, I agree with you. I don't know that a shift in propositional beliefs is quite as important as that piece indicates. And the if I were to think along with Let There Be, though, in the context of these findings, what I would say is that it seems to come down to some form of panpsychism, right? It comes down to some sense that everything is alive, everything has a measure of consciousness, right? And my consciousness is a part of some whole to which it returns after I am gone. There is no I, right? There is simply a field of awareness to which I belong and in which I am a point. And so there is nothing to fear from death, because in some sense, you just return to this matrix of consciousness in which all things participate, right? So you kind of have to take that lens if you want to make sense of how this works.
I think if we were honest about our panpsychism, we might entertain the idea of metempsychosis, to be honest. But one of the things that I'm thinking about here is the sharp distinction between value and valuation in a Deleuzian sense and mere ecstatic experience. And so the clinical literature that I looked at just ahead of this discussion celebrated the mystical experience, ego dissolution, oceanic boundlessness. But it's hard for me to escape this Nietzschean commitment that I think I maintain, that I think what's happening here is if we're viewing the end of life in its sort of optimized form, what it means for this psychedelic thanatologist is that we have this ecstatic experience that's followed by a belief shift, but that belief shift is one that orients us to transcendence. And the worry that I have there is that recapitulates our exclusion of the irrational in our life as a kind of excess that we ought to live with, and valorizes rationality. And it does so how? By essentially sort of like creating this little nihilistic bubble right at the threshold of death. And so for me, like, what happens when somebody doesn't die? We've pressed the affective reset button, but then it leaves the question intact whether or not we have a transformed orientation towards what matters or how things matter. And to this, I'll bring in the example from Deleuze's Immanence, a Life. And so this is a kind of like strong point of meditation, and we've done an episode on this, but just to sort of give us the summary version of that, there's a story written by Charles Dickens about a man in the community. I can't remember if he's a criminal, but he's not well liked, or maybe he's even reviled, and he has a heart attack, or he passes out on the floor, on the street, wherever he is. And in that moment, everyone abandons their subjective post and gathers around him. In that instant blossoms this new intensity, this new sort of collective intensity and a concern for his life. And it's in that moment we see a possibility that I think some of us harbor as either a kind of a secret wish or a desire or a way that community, the experience of community, might flourish. But sadly, for this moment, this man comes back to life. And in that instant, everybody returns to business as usual through their previous subjectivities, and all of the old values come swarming back to each one of the individuals who was by his side at the moment of his possible imminent death. And to me, I see that as a meditation on precisely what I'm talking about.
Yes. Yeah, I see what you mean. So, I mean, we do in some ways have, now, there is a clinical answer to this, and there is a more sort of broadly theoretical, philosophical answer to this. The clinical answer is pretty quick and it's easy, which is that the other case here would be not end-of-life anxiety, but regular major depression, which is treated in the same way, it's going to last a lifetime, technically, is what it should do. And so that transvaluation of values is something that should bear itself out for years and years and years, if that is what it is supposed to do. How do you value that transcendent experience? And how does it reframe what you understand to be what you value in life prior to that transcendent experience? Is something devalued by that ecstatic experience, right? Or in returning to life, if you like, do you learn to think of this as just another drug experience? That is another way of reckoning with this, right? And you get both. You get people who will say, this was the single most meaningful experience of my life. It has completely changed the way in which I look onto the world, and what I hold dear, what I think is good, true, beautiful has changed, right? I believe now that the divine is present in the world, right? To the point where this is no longer transcendent. It is the immanence of the divine, nothing less. That's one direction it takes. The other direction it will take is, yeah, that was a nice drug experience. It's a nice sort of relief from the world. It's a kind of reset. But at the end of the day, I have to return to the churning, grueling business of living in a world that is fundamentally not divine, that is unsatisfactory, and that this is a brief moment of ecstasy, a brief moment of communion with the divine that allows me to endure what is. And you get both attitudes. It's neither one nor the other necessarily. You can have the same person going back and forth between both. But I think one of the questions, to return to what you were saying earlier from the Deleuzean Nietzschean point, which is the affirmative versus the reactive stance that you could take. And one way you could look at this is there are ways in which this transcendent experience can be depressing. You come away with it convinced, and I know people who done this and said, oh, no, the world is mostly suffering. I can't wait to be done. Now, that's not a particularly affirming way of reckoning with that experience. It casts you in a position where this is something to be endured. And the affirming stance here would be, okay, knowing that this world is suffering, how do I affirm its joys?
I know people who've had psychedelic experiences also going into it with the best intentions and hoping to come out the other side transcended, and had a pretty rough ride, and undermining some of the values that they had prior to going into the experience, and some of the, we might call them illusions about what they might experience or how they might feel in the aftermath. And that kind of brings me to another question too. You know, recently online, I saw a pastor, it was a tweet by a pastor saying that at the end of life, many of the patients, he was a chaplain, and many of the patients or folks in hospice care that he dealt with often felt as if their lives were not complete. There were so many loose ends, and maybe those loose ends were drug into directions that seemed to have no terminus whatsoever. And therefore, many people were dying a confused death. In fact, I remember as a young man, one of the things that stuck out to me on like a 2-day retreat to a Zen temple was the Roshi of that temple said something to the effect of, you know, one of the reasons we practice Zen is so that we don't die a confused death. And that really stuck with me, because I don't know even if sitting for 20 minutes a day is going to stave off that possibility. And that's something that we may have to accept.
Yeah, it's interesting that you should bring up, the Zen case, because this is something that I'm writing about independently of, it's related, but independently of this, which is a piece on what the Tibetan Book of the Dead has done in psychedelic science.
Okay. Yeah, would love to hear that.
Well, the short version is it's actually there in certain questionnaires. Its organizing concepts have found its way there. But it returns to this way of experiencing life, which is in some sense non-judgmental. And to facilitate a passage, it is important to simply let go. Yes, nothing is going to resolve itself. The threads are going to remain loose, and you simply pass. And that is all. And in the early psychedelic thanatology, the Tibetan Book of the Dead becomes a resource, a sort of conceptual resource, and the journey provides a metaphorical resource for thinking about how to let go as you pass from this life into something. It's still framed as a passage. That is true, but with no clear terminus that we can necessarily make out. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, yes. But in the psychedelic experience, it is the passage that is the point, right? So that process of letting go is what is deemed to be the most valuable. I don't know how I feel about that, because is the opposite of that clinging? Are you not supposed to enjoy life?
Well, Sujit, I'll tell you this. I recently had an experience that I wrote about in my blog. My wife had a medical procedure, which, by the way, listeners, she's fine, which is great. But during that period, I had a brush with my own mortality, and I just nights sitting alone in my studio, maybe for an hour or 2 hours, just with death's sharpened beak pressed up against my neck, thinking about, the imminent possibility of death. And I just reflected in that moment that I did not have my philosophies, my theories were not there. There was no thought, and I was not availed by the years of research and interest in books that I thought would be there with me at the end. This blog was particularly popular on Substack, and a good friend of mine said, he confided in me saying, I've had experiences where I have a dream where I have, and in real life, he has a philosophical tattoo on his body. And in the dream, the tattoo is washing away. And when he's waking up, the first thing he does is check to see if the tattoo is still there. And I thought it was interesting because in that moment, I mean, for me, if we want to call it a spiritual lesson or an existential riddle to be solved, I mean, these are some ways that we redeem these experiences in our life, by ascribing a value to them. And then we can kind of situate them firmly in some cozy discourse about the way that we're supposed to die. But I think in the minute, in the immediacy of that moment, the terror and dread are real. And the question is, how do we go to that? And I think my ultimate concern with all this is I'm of two minds. I would love to, I don't love to end my life. But when my life does end, what does it involve? Maybe we're playing Boards of Canada on a stereophonic system. I'm just reclined with an old-fashioned or a rum and coke or something, and I just say goodbye and a big send-off with all my family and friends around me. But the reality is there is this sort of denuding and stripping down. And in my own psychedelic experiences, and I'm sure some listeners can relate, there's always that moment where the bottom drops out, right? We see the abyss. And that moment, that moment sort of contemplating my mortality felt a lot like that. But I still go back to what I said earlier. I think that feeling of the deep draw of the abyss is still part of the life. And I'm hesitant to sort of frame it in a negative sort of way. And maybe this is the challenge from a Deleuzean or Nietzschean standpoint is how do we exist in the face of that abyss? I mean, this is exactly what Nietzsche says, that the abyss is going to look back into you. But what does that look like in reality? It feels like an emptying out. But I think I've gone on long enough.
Well,
go ahead, Sush.
So the anthropologist and the historian in me wants to respond. Is that encounter with the abyss universal?
Okay.
Right? Or is it historically and culturally specific? And this can take various forms. I mean, I'm very aware that there is a certain degree of primitivism in psychedelic science where you just sort of say, natives have got it sorted out somewhere else. Or very often, you have to pay attention to the Hindus. And the Hindus have got this sorted out. And as somebody, I'm not a practicing Hindu or a practicing Catholic, which is the other thing I'm supposed to be. But having grown up around them, not entirely sure that there is anything about reincarnation that makes you particularly more at peace with the imminence of your death. But is the encounter of the abyss there necessarily? I would actually say not so much. That is not necessarily the way in which people contemplate death here. There is a sense of fatalism. When it is time for you to go, it is time for you to go. Is often the attitude. And there's no point being horrified. Is that encounter with the abyss inevitable? Does it look back into you? That returns to, like we were talking earlier about this being a sort of American middle class post-war hippie thing, right? One of the ways in which the emergence of psychedelic thanatology could be framed is that this is a problem of secularism. And in fact, I think I mentioned that psychedelic thanatology, and again, I should emphasize, this is my term, technically. It's the term of the research group, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. But anyway, one of the early things here was that it was a response to the culture of death problem, right? Which is you're now dying in medicalized settings. There are no religious professionals in the room. There are no rituals. There is no point at which this is marked as a sacred transition. There's nothing to prepare you to make peace with this. And so the encounter with your imminent demise is in fact denuded, right? I mean, Nietzsche has to contend with the abyss because there are no ultimate values.
Yeah. Yes. That's right.
So is that the predicament that we are all collectively in? A good psychedelic clinical trial for this would evaluate the way where you stand on this before you undergo the treatment. Right? It would find out, well, do you have a sense of the abyss before you? Is it the same framework that you've got? Another way of putting this is, do you actually believe in God or something along those lines before any of this occurs to you? And should that be controlled for? So I would still think the abyss thing, I'm not sure that it is universal.
I can jump in on the topic of the abyss as somebody who has had numerous psychedelic experiences with different subjects, and also a number of terrifying psychological experiences that were not related to drug use whatsoever or were associated with drugs that were not psychedelic. I think I've encountered the abyss and sheer terror and mortality, but never in a psychedelic context. The most terrifying experiences of my life, the points where I have come closest to the void, have never been under the influence of LSD or psilocybin or any of the other psychedelic substances I've tried. So this is part, for me, of why the rhetoric around psychedelic ego death, psychedelics in the abyss, the idea of dying before you die, vis-a-vis a psychedelic encounter, have never really landed. And that's just some context for what I'm about to say, which is that the psychedelic has become a framework perhaps for laundering the excesses and confusions and unassimilable aspects of death in our culture. I think this is sort of getting back to an earlier point that Craig made about something like the purification of death through psychedelia. And this can be connected to the commodification of psychedelics in the late 2010s and to this day, where on the heels of the psychedelic renaissance, venture capital came in to try to figure out how we could make as much money from psychedelic pharmaceuticals as possible. And I'm very concerned about the framing of psychedelics as, to put it in the most basic terms, but really get at what I'm getting at, a solution for death. At the same time that the right to die movement is being squared with these horrifying cases, I've heard of one or two at least in Canada, where people who are unable to work, who are badly disabled, who are ill but not terminally ill, have been encouraged to take the route of ending their life under austerity conditions, which is one of the most horrifying things that I can think of. So the conversation around death and what it means to be living a life that is worth living under late capitalism, currently, by my standards, breaking into fascism, while at the same time we have this movement to make death much more acceptable through a class of substances that are very poorly understood to this day and whose history of scientization and whose epistemological rendering has never been free of colonial import, etc. This all concerns me deeply and comes to bear on this. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, the Canadian thing is deeply distressing. There you have thanatopolitics, which is you have to make live, you also have to make die. It's not just let die in the Foucauldian framework. In the social formation that we live, which is fascist, and in this case, sort of oligarchic capitalist, what does it mean to make one's peace with death when the possibility of leading a healthy, satisfying life is hardly, not that it ever was, hardly equitably distributed, not least in a healthcare system that just does not let people lead healthy lives. And it is interesting. One aspect of it is that it is for at this point for terminal cancer patients. And it is, to return to the commodification point, there's a reason that the psychedelics industry and psychedelic science took up certain objects to address certain problems. And they were going to be the big mental health crises of our time, right? It was going to be PTSD, it was going to be substance use disorder, right? These are massive public health crises that psychedelic industry could claim that it was going to solve because it allows them to make money rather quickly, right? And you can see rapid returns. That was the idea, except it's not happening, right? They're not making a whole lot of money off this. And we know that there have been massive regulatory challenges. And Rick Doblin's idea of net zero trauma is not going to come to fruition anytime soon. The great thing about end of life anxiety patients is that they're going to die. And so, how do you value results? What are rapid returns? Well, rapid returns are measured by ratings on questionnaires. That's translated into financial value. So, a numerical score assigned on a questionnaire in terms of how there's literally something called the death transcendence scale. I kid you not. It's a questionnaire where you rate just how far along, right? And the more a particular intervention, and I should mention that there are patented analogs to psilocybin, which are created by certain psychedelic equivalent of big pharma, psychedelic startups, psychedelic industry, the more effectively you can show that there is a changing on the death transcendence scale, well, your stock valuation is going to rise. And the great thing is there's no follow-up. This person has 2 or 3 months to live. And in those 2 or 3 months, they've had this transformative experience. The transformative experience is highly rated. It has helped people come to terms with the fact that they're dying. And therefore, a company that is patenting a compound that delivers this sort of therapy at the end of your life is going to do very well. What does it mean to make peace with one's death under circumstances where healthcare is inequitably available? That is a tricky question for one or two reasons. One is that chances are that at least for the next 10 to 15 years, this form of therapy is only going to be available to the well-resourced. Because chances are that, even if insurance were to cover this, who is insured, really? That's one problem. The second is, as we've seen with the rise of ketamine therapy, it's private clinics predominantly. You're going to pay $3,000 a session or whatever the hell it is, right? And you do this as you're about to die. Of course, it is being marketed for everyone. And that takes us to the underground economy problem. And this is something that I've studied and written about in the book, which is forms of psychedelic entrepreneurship that occur through, for example, in the case of your death doula Uber driver. Chances are this is somebody who administers psychedelics to people that they know, who sits in as a facilitator while they sort of reckon with the grief and the imminence of their own demise or that of somebody that they know. And the science fuels this underground economy where people are increasingly desperate, are underserved by the healthcare industry, by the healthcare system, and will seek out remedies through what can often be rather dangerous sources. So you will have a steady stream of people who cannot afford healthcare, who are dying, who have been told by the media or who have read a great deal of coverage that says, hey, this is going to help you, and you seek it out. Right? And who knows what you encounter along the way, because there are plenty of bad actors in these spaces and there are plenty of get-rich-quick schemes. So these are the various ways I can see this unfolding. None of it is particularly positive, is it?
Just a strange question. Is it possible for the layperson to get their hands on the Death Transcendence Scale questionnaire?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Could you send it to us? And maybe I'll link it in the show notes. But I mean, that's just a curious item of late modernity. I just want to take a look at it for myself. And this then takes me to another question. And I guess we're kind of heading towards wrapping up. But when you're sitting with researchers at like Johns Hopkins or NYU, consider the conversation that we're having here today. Do you find that in a clinical framework, the folks who occupy that space collectively, is the hive mind there capacious enough to hold what's actually happening in this particular conversation and influence the direction of how these researches go? Or do you think it tends to sort of drift back into the dominant medical tendency of our time?
I would say that there are some people who are very much capable of thinking in those capacious terms. And expressing concerns about the way in which the commodification of psychedelics might be disastrous, not only for researchers, but for people who might take them in the underground, who are very alert to the, in medical anthropology and in bioethics, you would call this the ethical, legal, social implications of a new technology or a new intervention. And there are whole programs designed around this. And technically, it was a requirement at one point that any new study into some sort of emerging novel health technology should have this LC element built into it. So there are people who are alert to this. There is a bioethics community that maintains a dialogue with these psychedelics researchers or is embedded in their research. So there are people who are thoughtful about this. And then there are folks for whom it takes a rather interesting turn, where the idea is, look, the mental health care system is broken and that medicine as it is not working. Right. And perhaps that demonstrates the limits of biomedicine, the limits of healthcare as we know it. And so something more is required. Some kind of transformation is needed. Right. And that is another way of thinking beyond the medicalized lens, but it is one which inevitably gets reterritorialized. Right. And that happens rather quickly because it reorganizes itself into psychedelic big pharma or into private clinics, which purportedly offer some sort of alternative. And at the same time, really just replicate that same logic and return to the same way of pathologizing altered states, let's say, and insist on rather similar modes of intervention. So that's happening. I mean, I remember once interviewing, sometimes these biotech startup people are the really interesting presences in these rooms. There's a fellow who said the mystical experience component of the psychedelic drug thing is destined to go. Right. He thinks that the next generation of psychedelic drugs are, in fact, going to be almost non-psychoactive. They're called psychoplastogens. They're going to act at a receptor site level, and you're not really going to feel any pronounced psychological effects beyond a slight mood boost. They're going to become the next generation antidepressant. Right. The exception, he told me, is probably going to be for end-of-life anxiety patients, because they can have a full-blown mystical experience, and it may be good for them. And that is the space where, in an increasingly within psychedelic industry, there is going to be a sort of little industry for people who want mystical experiences in a clinical setting, quite aside from the kind that you can get in a retreat or a religious setting, which is an entirely other domain that I won't go into at the moment. So the way it works for them is they see these many, many channels through which psychedelic drugs are being medically mainstreamed. Some of them are alert to these risks. Others see business opportunities. But in one way or another, I think even when they're trying to think themselves out of this logic, they do get sucked back in.
The last thing that I think I have in mind for you, Sujit, is directly related to this. And perhaps it's not a fair question. I'm just really curious about what you think. I think it might be a difficult one to answer. Basically, what is to be done, or what's an ideal scenario? Obviously, we're seeing the institutionalization of psychedelics play out in the same way, maybe slightly different manifestations, but ultimately the effect is the same. If we want to keep them non-institutional, which seems to be the way to preserve whatever they can do for us without qualification, what does this look like in practice? I'm not going to ask you maybe about policy per se, capital P, but yeah.
I mean, the easy answer to this is just greater literacy. And literacy not only around its benefits, but substantially about its risks. I do believe that this is something I like to say is that people don't take these compounds sufficiently seriously, or they take them altogether too seriously. Right? They're not going to fix everything. You don't want to trust every insight you have in a psychedelic drug. At the same time, you want to be able to use them in circumstances which are almost as close as you can get in terms of the safeguards to the clinical setting, almost. Right? By which I mean, if you're taking it at home, and of course, I mean, this is how do you get out of this sort of the logic of psychedelic industry or of legalization and medicalization? You've got to have access to these substances, these natural substances, outside institutionalized channels. That doesn't mean that you abandon some of the safeguards. And if your shaman is telling you, hey, it's fine, you should sit with 30 people, and we're going to all be outside in the middle of nowhere, and we're going to sort of chant the same thing, and afterwards I'm going to introduce a little cult leader, your ears should sort of prick, and you're like, I'm not going near that, right? At the same time, people are desperate for solutions. For a lot of people, they're out of alternatives. And so how do you ensure that people who are likely to try anything, whatever comes their way because they need it, are nonetheless aware that if you've got a family history of psychosis, this may not be right for you?
I mean, what I'm hearing here as being there's a risk in even saying that it's the fundamental problem, but probably one of the largest problems in our purview with respect to this issue, this question, is whether or not we are going to confront death with a totalizing or finalizing view of our life. Because really that question brings to bear on almost everything that we do. And this is perhaps why I've cloven so closely to the work of Nietzsche and Deleuze on the question of life and death in particular. My last question would be then, Sujit, if you were in a position where, let's say, you were terminally ill or in hospice care, would you undergo one of these experiences? Would you like to? Not even for science sake. Let's put that off of the table. Let's say you weren't even immersed in this community. Would you do it? Or would you want to?
Do you know the story of how Aldous Huxley went out?
Yes, I do. The heroic dose right at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. So he has his wife inject him with LSD in his final hours, and off he goes. A well-versed psychonaut, prepared for what it is, at peace with the fact that he's going, and merging with the cosmos. I'm just going to say that doesn't sound terrible.
We hope that you enjoyed today's discussion with Sujit. One of the threads running underneath everything that we talked about today was the question of what escapes or exceeds the rationalist frameworks that dominate modern medicine. The mystical, the anomalous, the generative strangeness that keeps breaking down through the clinical gaze. That is precisely the terrain that Dr. Timothy Jackson's upcoming course at the Acid Horizon Research Commons sets out to think through philosophically. Called Ontogenesis is Impossible, it's a 5-week seminar drawing on Simondon, Bataille, Sherman, and others to ask what it means to take becoming, process, and emergence as primary, to think life as fundamentally exceeding the mechanical models we impose on it. If today's conversation left you wanting a deeper philosophical toolkit for thinking about life and death and what medicine can't quite capture, this course is a natural next step. You can find it at our website, acidhorizonresearchcommons.com. Also coming this summer, Penn State professor Nicholas DeWarren on science fiction and posthumanism, and former guest and Penn State PhD candidate Tyreek McGeorge on the revolutionary thought of Frantz Fanon. We are building something here, and we want you to be part of it. Now, as our program evolves, so do our practices and our commitments. For those with the means and desire to enroll, your support does more than just secure your own seat. It directly funds scholarship places for students who couldn't otherwise attend. The more paid enrollees we have, the more scholarships we can offer. We typically open anywhere between 1 to 5 scholarship seats per course, announced about a week before each class begins. Your enrollment is an act of solidarity as much as it is an investment in your own intellectual life. If you would like to support a new direction for the humanities, or if you have an idea for a 4-week course and want to submit a brief proposal, reach out to us at acidhorizonresearchcommons@gmail.com. We review proposals on a rolling basis and will be in touch with instructors whose work aligns with our vision. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next time.